Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. When the nuclear age dawned, people spoke of being present at the creation. Man suddenly had the ability to completely remake the world anew, or even destroy it. Today, our environmental crisis gives us the same power. The existential crisis we face, driven by the pillars of population growth, technology, short-term thinking, and denial of science, also give us the power to destroy the world. In fact, much of the destruction may already be underway, and it may even be too late to reverse some of it. We may be entering what my guest Elizabeth Kolbert calls the sixth extinction. Elizabeth Kolbert is the author of Under the White Sky, Field Notes from a Catastrophe, and The Sixth Extinction, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she's received 2 National Magazine Awards, and it is my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Kolbert here to the Who, What, Why podcast. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. We talk a lot about climate change and the impact that that's having. This really goes beyond that. Talk a little bit about the issues that you're focusing on in the sixth extinction.
Well, it's a tale that sort of grew out of climate change and my, reporting on that, which was a book that I published almost a decade ago, I guess, about climate change. And I was looking for, in a lot of ways, a follow-up. I was going to do this book that was, going to maybe tell people how to solve climate change or something like that. And I kept bumping up against this idea or fact, I guess, more to put it better, that climate change is really just one of the ways that people are altering the planet on a planetary global scale and on a geological scale, so in a way that is going to still be discernible, many, many millions of years from now. And that is a really, that's sort of a thought that certainly changed the way I look at the world, and I hope I convey it in a way that changes the way that everyone looks at it. And so among the other ways that we're altering the planet on a permanent basis, we're putting a lot of carbon. When we put carbon into the air, we're also putting it into the water, into the oceans. When CO2 dissolves in water, it forms an acid, so we are acidifying the oceans. That's a very, very serious thing to be doing. We're moving species all around the world, so we're bringing together these evolutionary lineages that have been separated for, in many cases, tens of millions of years. That can have very, very serious effects. We're, just altering the surface of the earth. I think everybody realizes that. We've altered, at least 50% of the land surface of the earth. So that obviously has a huge impact on species. So these are all, traces that we're going to leave that will be, for all intents and purposes, permanent. And unfortunately, one of the unifying themes of all this is extinction. All of these changes are happening very rapidly and too rapidly for many creatures to keep up with.
And as you look back at this, as you look in your reporting at this collision between civilization and the ecosystem of the planet, what do we find to have been the tipping point when all of this really started to take hold, when we started to see even the beginnings of this extinction?
Well, I think that, one of the interesting revelations of the last, even just decade or even just years, a lot of important papers have been published, is that this process of altering the planet is really quite old. Human beings have been altering the planet on a pretty significant scale for a pretty long time. So, for example, people arrived in Australia, modern humans arrived in Australia about 50,000 years ago, which is quite an amazing fact. It was not easy to get to Australia 50,000 years ago. And when they got there, they encountered this extraordinary array of very large animals, these huge marsupials that are called rhinoceros wombats that seem to have looked like giant guinea pigs, huge kangaroos, huge birds, sort of ostrich-like birds, but not ostriches, not related to ostriches, huge tortoises with horns growing out of their heads, and pretty rapidly, within a couple thousand years, all of those animals were gone. And that almost certainly had to do with the arrival of people. That was no coincidence. And we see that, over and over again, that when people arrived in a new place, the big animals, the slow to reproduce animals, wink out. And so I think that, on some level, this goes back way, way further than we might like to even think.
One of the questions, though, is, and I think one of the things that people don't follow all the way through to its logical conclusion, is the way this potentially will impact us at this point. That it's not just a question of altering and eliminating these species, but it circles back to have a direct impact on our lives.
Well, I think that's one of the great questions, of course. How is this going to impact us? And unfortunately, it's a very, very risky business that we've embarked upon. Our impacts are ratcheting up, just extraordinarily at an amazing rate. For example, the amount of CO2 that we're putting in the air continues to increase every single year. And what the impact of that is going to be on humanity, on human society, which has been founded on a lot of stability when you think about it, is sort of hard to predict. We are very, very unpredictable creatures, but it's not the kind of gamble that I think smart money would make. Let's put it that way.
But in fact, it is the kind of gamble we seem to be taking at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. We are taking a sort of, I guess I would say we're taking an uninformed risk. We're just blithely marching along as if there were no risks. I think it's really, really important, and many people have made this point. I'm certainly not the only person out there making it, that we better make some more informed choices. And climate change is a really key and obvious example. We know there are huge risks that we are taking. You would think that for our own sakes, certainly for the sakes of our kids and our grandchildren, we would try to minimize those risks. We don't seem to be doing that. We seem to be denying that there are those risks, but just by denying them, doesn't make them go away.
And in many ways, even beyond denying them, we also believe, sometimes blindly, I suppose, in technology that somehow before the risk actually happens, we will figure out a technological fix.
Right, exactly. We love that thought. And, the fact that there are 7.2 billion of us on the planet seems to support this idea that, well, whatever happens, we just blithely go on, and so far, human population has kept increasing. So yes, you would have to say that's true. That trajectory has so far been ever upward, and it's possible that will continue. But just I use the line from that you get on a mutual fund prospectus in the book. Past performance is no guarantee of future success, and the history of life teaches us that. Many very, very dominant groups of animals that were around for a lot longer than human beings, or even primates have been around, are now gone, and something did them in. It wasn't their own action in general, but there are no guarantees in this business. This business, which is life.
Talk a little bit about the species that have disappeared thus far and what impact that's had in places like the Great Barrier Reef and the Andes and the rainforests. Well,
the reefs are very, really interesting and haunting story. Reefs are a major ecosystem. They're home to probably millions of species. They're quite amazing places. One of the things I got to do in the process of reporting this book was go to the Great Barrier Reef, which is, I would say, one of the most spectacular places on Earth. It stretches over 1,500 miles, and when you look down on a reef, you see just this amazing array of life. There's really no, this shimmering, crowded, almost city of life, let's say, underwater, incredibly beautiful fish and sharks and rays and turtles and giant clams and things, beyond your imagination. And there's really no analog on land. You never see that much life on land, even in the rainforest. And reefs are being very, very severely affected by a lot of different things. The Great Barrier Reef has lost about half of its coral cover just in the last 30 years, which is very, very alarming. And there are pretty robust predictions that if we continue, on our merry way, owing to a combination of of climate change and ocean acidification, reefs are just going to cease to be able to function by around the middle of this century. And then you would lose this, sort of major ecosystem. And what the ripple effects of that would be are hard to predict. There have been times in Earth's history where there's what are known as reef gaps, where there have been no reefs. And they tend to be associated with some very, very severe crises in the history of life.
One of the things you've talked about is that we don't really have experience with what we're going through right now, that we've never been in a situation where we've been both responsible for the extinction of species and had to manage it at the same time.
Right. I mean, to go back to the example of Australian, of humans reaching Australia, and then over the course of many generations, probably wiping out the large fauna, the megafauna. They were probably, completely unconscious of what they were doing, and it was something that, took place over many generations. People really didn't realize, presumably, what was going on. They didn't have written records that they handed down at that point. We are in this very, very unusual, I'd say unique position, really, where we have such sophisticated science that we have, very good predictive powers. We're watching these things happen. We have, we occupy all the continents. We have very good data on a lot of species, and we're watching this happen in real time. We are aware of it, and we have to, sort of, I guess my point would be, we need to really bring this to the top of our awareness and make some choices as opposed to just blindly sort of blundering into a potentially, very disastrous future.
What do you think is the primary thing that prevents us from facing up to this and making the choices that we might have to make?
Well, I don't have a, sort of complete psychological profile. I think that one of the interesting things is humans are a product of evolution, just like all other organisms. And I don't think it's one of the fascinating facts about us that we're, while we're extremely clever, we're capable of these amazing technologies. We're not very good. It doesn't seem like we're very good at planning very far in the future, even though we're capable of doing things that have impacts that will last, for all intents and purposes forever. So E.O. Wilson has this line about how we have, Stone Age brains and godlike technologies. And when you bring those together, it's not necessarily a good outcome.
Talk a little bit about previous extinctions and what, in fact, we might learn from looking at the historical record in that regard.
Well, there's a lot of work going on right now looking at these previous 5 major mass extinctions, which are sometimes known as the Big Five. And one, the most recent, the 5th, the one that did in the dinosaurs about 66 million years ago, there's a pretty broad consensus that was caused by an asteroid impact. And when that was discovered, which was not very long ago, it was only 20, 30 years ago, people went back and they kind of thought, well, that would be very elegant if each of these extinctions was caused by an asteroid impact. And they went back and they looked for signs of asteroid impact at each one of these moments, and they did not find them. So right now, there is no one cause that we can identify for mass extinctions. What seems to unite them is that they're actually very, very freakish events. The world changes fast in a way that many organisms do not have the capacity to adapt to. They have never encountered this in their evolutionary history. And so in that sense, we, are a logical agent of mass extinction because we are also new to evolutionary history, intelligent, creatures like humans who are really very different in many ways from other forms of life, and our technologies change the world very, very rapidly and in ways that you can imagine many creatures can't keep up with.
In that sense, we really don't know what the consequence will be from a partial extinction. In other words, 20%, 30%, 40% of species disappearing. We really don't know what the tipping point might be in terms of its larger consequences.
No, exactly. And I mean, obviously none of us have been around through these mass extinctions in the past. I quote a British paleontologist who says that one of the things that seems to happen during these moments of very rapid change is that the rules of the survival game change, so that groups of very dominant, organisms, such as the dinosaurs who were around for quite a long time and did very, very well, are suddenly gone. There's some reason for that every species of dinosaur was done in that last extinction event. We don't know what it is. We don't know what made them particularly vulnerable and allowed a few mammals, who were our evolutionary ancestors, to creep through that extinction. But when the rules of the survival game change, you don't really know exactly what's going to come out at the other end. So that is another reason why it's just a very, very big gamble.
Talk a little bit about climate change itself and the ways in which the climate change is exacerbating some of these other dangers.
Well, climate change is occurring very, very rapidly. It's occurring, pretty much everywhere. And what happens, what we can very, very clearly see is that many, many species are on the move. Right? They're migrating. They're migrating towards the poles. They're migrating upslope, and this, goes for plants as well as animals. Goes for things that can't even move but can now seed themselves. They spread their seeds, and those seeds now germinate at higher and higher elevations, or higher and higher latitudes. And when you have everything needing to migrate to track this climate, right, and it's been estimated that to track the climate, species would have to move something like 30 feet a day. I mean, incredible, everything on the march at a pretty rapid rate. Then what happens when you reach a barrier? So, species are capable of tremendous amounts of migration. We know that by looking at, for example, the last ice age was a major climatic change, and pretty much most things made it through that transition by moving. And so we know they are capable of moving quite long distances, even tiny little organisms. But when you put up these barriers, as we have, what about, the city of San Francisco, the city of New York, the city of LA? What about a road even? A lot of species don't even want to cross a road. What happens when you reach, a cornfield where there's nothing for, many, many species to eat? So we don't really know what's going to happen as we create the situation where many, many species are on the move, but also where we have put up these roadblocks. So what that's another situation where the rules of the game have just really been altered.
Elizabeth Kolbert. Elizabeth, I thank you so much for spending time with us today on the Who, What, Why podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.